Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating debate in Islamic jurisprudence, specifically the legal rulings around the beard. And just a quick note before we start, to keep us entirely focused on the pure logic of the law itself, we won't be using any drawings or depictions of people today. We're going to impartially map out how scholars actually interact with ancient texts, how they weigh evidence, and how they arrive at their legal conclusions. Okay, let's look at our roadmap. First, we'll cover the core debate, then imitation and resemblance, followed by changing Allah's creation, then commands and obligations, and we'll wrap it up with the final verdict. Part 1, the core debate, outlining the arguments. So what exactly are we looking at here? We're examining a very specific legal clash. On one side, we have Sheikh Al-Albaani's well-known stance arguing for the strict prohibition of shaving the beard. On the other side, we have Sheikh Al-Uwaida's highly systematic point-by-point rebuttal. It literally all boils down to this single everyday question. Is shaving the beard strictly prohibited, meaning haram, under Islamic law? Now, you might think it's a simple yes or no, right? But as you'll see, the way legal texts are interpreted to answer this reveals an incredible depth of jurisprudential methodology. To answer that question, Sheikh Al-Albaani built his case for prohibition on 4 distinct pillars. He argued that shaving violates Islamic law because 1. It constitutes imitation of disbelieving Europeans. 2. It's an unauthorized changing of Allah's creation. 3. It's a direct violation of a prophetic command. And 4. It constitutes a resemblance to women. So for the rest of this explainer, we're going to systematically cross-examine each of these 4 points through the lens of Sheikh Al-Uwaida's rebuttal. Let's get into it. Part 2, imitation and resemblance, defining boundaries. First up, let's unpack a specific term, taqlid. It simply means imitation or following the practices of others. Sheikh Al-Albaani argued that shaving is an imitation of Europeans and therefore prohibited. But to analyze this legally, we have to understand how taqlid is actually applied in the rules of jurisprudence. Well, Sheikh Al-Uwaida breaks taqlid down into 2 entirely distinct categories. First, we have matters of deen, or religion. Imitating the distinct religious practices of non-believers, like say wearing the specific garb of a priest or putting up a Christmas tree, is strictly prohibited, or haram. But then, on the flip side, we have matters of dunya, or worldly life. Imitating everyday worldly actions, like wearing a business suit, or as a way to argue shaving facial hair, actually falls under this permissible category, unless the act itself is inherently forbidden. Because think about it, Europeans don't shave as an act of religious worship, right? So imitating them in this completely worldly habit doesn't automatically trigger a religious prohibition. Al-Uwaida applies a really similar logical framework to Al-Albaani's argument about resembling women. Legally speaking, for there to be true resemblance, a man would have to abandon an exclusively male attribute and adopt an exclusively female one, like wearing specific types of jewelry historically bound only to women. However, shaving the beard is an incredibly widespread practice among millions of men globally. It is a shared reality, definitely not an exclusive female trait. Therefore, removing facial hair doesn't suddenly strip away a man's general categorization as a male in the real world. Part 3, changing Allah's creation, text versus context. Now, Sheikh Al-Albaani relies heavily on his specific verse from the Quran. He quotes Satan's promise, "I will order them to change the nature created by Allah." Al-Albaani uses this exact text to argue that shaving the beard is an unauthorized, forbidden physical alteration of God's creation. But let's see how Al-Uwaida counters this by mapping out the timeline. If you look at the contextual timeline of this verse within Surah An-Nisa, the surrounding passages are entirely about aqidah, meaning core theological beliefs, idolatry, and associating partners with God. Historically, the verse about changing creation refers to the pagan practice of altering elements of nature, like the sun or stones, into idols to be worshipped. So, because the scope of the verse is strictly about theological belief, Al-Uwaida concludes it's legally invalid to just pluck this verse out of its context to enforce practical Sharia rulings about personal grooming. And this brings us to a highly technical but absolutely critical term, illa. Basically, this is the underlying legal reason or cause for a ruling. If a scholar claims something is prohibited, they absolutely must correctly identify the illa that causes that prohibition. It's the linchpin of the whole argument. To support his stance, Al-Albaani points to a well-known hadith cursing women who practice tattooing or artificially create gaps in their teeth. The text explicitly states they are cursed for changing the features created by Allah. Al-Albaani draws a direct analogy here. If women are cursed for changing their features for beauty, well, men who shave their beards for beauty are equally guilty of the exact same illah. So the crucial point is how Aweda completely deconstructs this. In Islamic jurisprudence, an illah must be perfectly consistent. It literally cannot fluctuate. If changing creation was the absolute legal reason for prohibition, then every single act of changing creation would be a sin. Think about what that means. That would mean cutting the hair in your head or even trimming your fingernails would be strictly haram. But because Islamic law explicitly permits trimming nails and hair, changing creation fails the test of being a consistent illah. Instead, Wada argues the hadith is specifically limiting extreme body modifications for women and just cannot be logically expanded to prohibit men from shaving.
Part 4. Commands and Obligations Interpreting
Moving on, Sheikh Al-Albaani presents a direct command from the Prophet: shorten your mustaches and grow from your beards. For Al-Albani, the phrasing is a clear-cut amr, a direct command, and therefore acts as undeniable proof of a strict legal obligation. But here is the critical question Al-Aweda poses. Does a command in these texts automatically equal a strict, binding mandate, a wajib? Or does it actually require a linking indicator, known in jurisprudence as a karina, to prove it's a strict obligation rather than just a strong recommendation?
And this brilliantly illustrates Uveda's point. He pulls parallel examples straight from the texts. For instance, the Prophet commanded his followers to differ from the Jews by praying in their shoes. He commanded them to differ from others by dyeing their white hair. Now, scholars universally agree that praying in shoes and dyeing hair are not strict obligations. They're just recommendations. Since the command to grow the beard was also phrased as a way to differ from the fire worshippers, the Majus, Al-Aweda argues it must logically fall into the exact same category. It's a recommendation, for sure, but not a strict mandate.
Part 5. The Final Verdict, Sunnah versus Wajib.
Synthesizing all these arguments together, we actually see a complete shift in the ruling. The initial claim posited that shaving is strictly haram, based on imitation, altering creation, defying a command, and resembling women. But by systematically neutralizing each of those 4 points, recategorizing worldly imitation, contextualizing verses about creation, and proving commands don't always equal mandates, Al-Uweda's rebuttal concludes that growing the beard is classified as a sunnah, a highly recommended practice, but shaving it does not constitute a wajib or strict legal violation. It's an incredible look under the hood of Islamic jurisprudence, isn't it? Which leaves us with a final thought. How does understanding this incredibly complex architecture of textual interpretation change how you view everyday practices? When you realize just how much precision goes into deriving a single ruling, it transforms a simple question into a fascinating journey of logic. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep seeking clarity, and we'll see you next time.